All right, we're continuing on here with the third meditation, wherein Descartes is going to argue for the existence of God, as you can see based on the subtitle there at the top of the slide. Descartes, unlike other authors who have argued for the existence of God, isn't really interested in the question in and of itself in the way that maybe someone like St. Augustine or Aquinas was interested in it, but rather he's using this section of the book to work towards what he's trying to prove overall in the text. And that's, that there's some sort of rigorous and lasting foundation for scientific knowledge. And ultimately, you can probably already tell, it comes down to consciousness. It comes down to the thinking thing. It comes down to thought itself. God, you're going to find, is going to be an important piece of this argument. It's going to be an important step that enables Descartes to ultimately argue towards that conclusion. So we begin here with Descartes, as he does in every meditation, falling back into his radically doubting attitude, this radical skepticism. Remember that in the previous meditation, he decided upon this conception of himself as a thinking thing. But he's going to raise some new problems here. And again, these problems are all going to beckon the sort of question of whether God exists, and if God exists, what that would mean for Descartes' argument. Descartes writes, "Even though these things that I sense or imagine may perhaps be nothing at all outside of me, nevertheless I am certain that these modes of thinking, which are cases of what I call sensing and imagining, insofar as they are merely modes of thinking, do exist within me." But he's going to go on and tell us even more about thinking. In the previous meditation, he gave us a few examples of mental activities that he contains under the category of thinking, as I said in my lecture, but he's going to elaborate even further upon this. So, thus far, he's concluded that he's a thinking thing, and he hasn't really done anything else with this. And the important question is, what does it mean to be certain about this? You'll see that the way Descartes analyzes this question of what it means to have certainty about his status as a thinking thing is going to kind of reflect the nature, the structure of the argument that he will employ throughout the rest of this book. So to be certain, and I already told you in the last lecture that this was coming, means to have a clear and distinct perception. We'll often just write this in shorthand as CDP. Again, a clear and distinct perception. I know something is certain when I have a clear and distinct perception of it. And this is the proof for the apodicticity of experience. Apodicticity is just a fancy GRE type word, meaning indubitable, which itself is probably a bit of a mouthful. But again, the idea here is just 100% certain. An experience is trustworthy, and experience can be considered to be accurate, can be considered to be factual, so to speak. He doesn't really use these terms, but we could say this when it presents itself clearly and distinctly. And we find that a lot of mathematical truths are ones that are clearly and distinctly perceived by us, right? So 2 + 2 = 4. We all perceive that to be true, clearly and distinctly. But this would also apply to sensory phenomena. So, for example, a few years ago, there was this dress that went viral on the internet where people were basically seeing it in two different ways, either as white and gold or as black and blue, or a black and the sort of purplish color. I personally see it the latter way, right? I see it this way, though, clearly and distinctly, so I can be certain about what I see. And if one of you sees it as white and gold, and you see it clearly and distinctly, then you can be certain about what you see. This sort of difference is fine. Descartes' theory allows for this. But the problem is that the external world does not always present itself to us clearly and distinctly. And that's the big problem here, or at least one of our big problems. Remember, Descartes is really concerned about the possibility that there's some sort of evil god or evil demon who's a deceiver and who has tricked us into experiencing reality in a way that in fact it really is not. So in current day terms, we could think of this as like a computer simulation. We could think of this as brains in vats is another common way to put this. We could think of it as something like the Matrix, right, which is what the picture here is supposed to represent to you. This is the big problem, right? The external world is not always clear and distinct. And think also of dreams. Very rarely do we perceive them clearly and distinctly. But in our ordinary waking life, when we lack this clarity, when we lack this distinctness, isn't it possible that we're dreaming? Isn't it possible that everything is a dream and we never really are awake like we think we are? This, in short, is the problem. Now, as I said, though, we can turn back to a mathematical standard for a CDP. 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's just totally unquestionable. It seems totally true, even if we have difficulty maybe explaining why it's true. It just seems untouchable. But how far does clear and distinct perception really go? I mean, in the case of mathematics, it seems pretty safe, right? It seems like something we can be really confident in. But what other situations can we ascribe clarity and distinctness to in a way that's accurate, in a way that's scientifically rigorous? And what is the problem even with clear and distinct perception? Well, the big issue here is that clear and distinct perception is ultimately limited, is ultimately qualified, is ultimately suspicious without some sort of foundation. Again, this is because of the possibility of an evil demon or an evil god who might be deceiving us. It's possible that even when we clearly and distinctly perceive something, we're only experiencing something that this evil deceiver put into our heads. It's not real. It's not genuine. So this is why we need a foundation. We need to be sure. We need to have something that we build upon in a way that is trustworthy. So even the clear and distinct perception of a thinking thing is once more in question. It's something that we again have to doubt. We again have to view with suspicion until we come up with some sort of foundation for it. So how is Descartes going to approach this? What's his approach going to involve? Well, again, it's going to come down to God. Descartes says, I should at the first opportunity inquire whether there is a God, and if there is, whether or not he can be a deceiver. For if I am ignorant of this, he means if I'm ignorant of the nature of God, if I'm ignorant of what type of God is out there, then it appears I'm never capable of being completely certain about anything else. But kind of frustratingly, before he gets to this question, he's actually going to need to do a little bit of analysis first. He says, I'll probably need to come up with distinctions between the different types of thoughts. And he doesn't really say this super clearly, but the whole point here is he needs to find out what sort of type of thought the thought of God is going to be. Okay? So the three types of thoughts are ideas, volition, which is a fancy word just meaning an act of the will, right? So like willing to be successful, or willing to run a little bit further when you're doing some sprints or something like this. And then lastly, a judgment. The three types of thoughts, okay? And he's got a little bit to say about these three types of thoughts and how they are differentiated from one another. Importantly, he says an idea, first of all, cannot be false, properly speaking. An idea can never be false. So even if you have a bad idea, even if you have an idea that maybe a lot of people disagree with, it cannot be false. Insofar as it's an idea that you have, it is true, okay? Now, the same goes for a volition, an act of the will. It cannot be false. Descartes says even choosing to be bad, even choosing to be evil, despite the fact that people may disagree with this, despite the fact that people may say that it's wrong, it is not something that we would call false. Insofar as it is someone's volition, it is something that is true. Lastly, we have judgments, and judgments are different. Judgments can be false. A judgment is where you're saying that one thing is larger than another. A judgment is where you're maybe saying that some people are smarter than other types of people. You can definitely be wrong here. You can definitely say something that's false. And this comes down to incorrectly comparing two or more things. Descartes says, the most frequent erroneous judgment, erroneous just meaning in error, the most frequent erroneous judgment is judging that the ideas that are in me, meaning in my mind, in my head, in my senses even, remember he says that sensation and imagination are ideas, are representative of external things, okay? So you have some idea about the way that external reality is. Maybe you believe, let's use kind of a silly example, although the people who believe this don't think it's silly at all. You have this idea that the earth is flat, and you think that this idea corresponds to the way the world actually is shaped. You think that external reality really is comprised of a flat earth, okay? So that would be an example, at least as far as a scientist or an astronomer is concerned, of an erroneous judgment. Someone who believes this theory would be harder to convince that they're wrong. Of course, you've probably heard about how strongly convicted people are about that belief. But there's also other examples of erroneous judgments where you have an internal idea that doesn't really map onto external reality. And ordinarily in a non-online class, I show a video of someone who experiences phantom limb syndrome. This is where you have a limb that was amputated. Maybe you don't have a left arm, or maybe you don't have a left hand, or something like this. Maybe you're missing a leg. And despite the fact that you do not have a limb there, you feel like you do. You have the sensation of it. You have the experience of it in a sensuous way, that body part is still there. And the problem is, a lot of the time, people who experience these phantom limbs will experience the limb in excruciating pain. They'll feel like their hand that isn't there is clenched tightly and it's hurting them. And the problem is they can't figure out how to open it. So there's this neuroscientist named V.S. Ramachandran who actually invented something called the mirror box. And he uses the mirror box to help these people alleviate their painful symptoms. And basically the way it works, if you type in what I have there at the bottom, or if you pause the video and pull up that link or copy it, you'll be able to find this, is people look into a reflection of a limb that they have, right? There's this little mirror box that shows a reflection of the right arm if the person is missing the left. And what the person does is they're able to look at this reflection and see a limb that is there that really is not in a physical sense, and they can open their hand, and all of a sudden the pain goes away. So it's a really fascinating invention. I recommend you take a look at it. Now, ideas in particular we're going to elaborate upon a little bit more. Descartes is going to say that there are three sources of ideas, three different places that ideas can come from. An idea, first of all, can be innate, meaning it's something that you just have. It's something that is natural. But when an idea is innate, it is an idea that is not made up by you. This is the important part. An innate idea cannot be something that you just invented or came up with. Secondly, you have an adventitious idea. An adventitious idea is just an idea that came from outside of you. So Descartes will talk about the example of seeing the moon or seeing the sunset or something like this. This is an example of an adventitious idea. The sun has to be there, in other words, for you to have the visual experience of it. The source of it is something outside of you. Lastly, we have the self-produced idea. This, in contrast to the idea that is not made up by you, is precisely an idea that you invented. Precisely an idea that you just created with your imagination or your intellect or whatever. It is something that is your own invention. So I often have students take a look at these three different graphics and tell me what are the sources for each of these ideas. We have a sunset, we have a mythical creature, specifically a hippogriff, and then we have a triangle with various lines dissecting and bisecting it. So I recommend you pause the video here and make sure that you're able to parse out what the different sources of these ideas are. There's one of each, of course. So here's the next question that Descartes will address. Why do I believe that adventitious ideas, that is, ideas that are derived from things outside of me, resemble the real things of the external world? Right? This is a big question. Why do I have this assumption? Why do I believe this? Is there any external world at all, Descartes wonders? Or is it possible that he made it all up? Nature, Descartes says, is what leads us to assume that an adventitious idea resembles real things in the external world, in so-called external reality. Meaning, habit, right? Descartes will say, by nature, I want to clarify what I mean. I do not mean driven by a spontaneous impulse. I don't just mean that it's like instinctual or something like this. I don't mean that it's shown by the light of nature to be true either. Meaning, I don't mean that it is just self-evident, obvious. However, what we do mean in this case is habitual. We mean that it's traditional. We mean that it's something like a blind impulse, as you see moving down the slide here. It's a blind impulse that leads me to make this assumption about my ideas, reflecting my ideas, corroborating with external reality and the external world. And it's going to get a little more technical from here. This is by far the most difficult meditation. It's by far the most technically complex chapter in the whole book, so you'll have to bear with me. But Descartes is next going to move into an analysis of modes and substances. Descartes is going to say that a mode is defined as a property and a characteristic of a thing. For example, the location of a thing, the shape of a thing, the color of a thing, all of these sorts of properties. Substances, by contrast, are the things themselves, a particular thing, whether it's a rock, dog, God, my mind, my desk, a building, what have you. Now here's where it gets kind of tricky. The modes of finite thinking substance, which Descartes says is what my mind is. It is a thinking thing, remember. We're just changing the wording here to thinking substance. And we're saying that it's finite because you have a finite intellect. You do not have an infinite mind. You obviously cannot know everything there is to know. You can't calculate any possible mathematical equation like a supercomputer could. So you have a finite thinking substance. This is what you are, right? Now the modes of your finite thinking substance are ideas, volitions, and judgments. In other words, the three different types of thoughts. Why does he call them modes? Well, again, just like the location or shape of a thing, your mind isn't really defined by these things, right? Your mind rather can take up any thought whatsoever, any idea, any volition or willing, any judgment, right? These things come and go, they pass, they do not really define substantially what you are, and that is a thinking thing. Now for Descartes, ideas in particular are representational, meaning that they stand for things, but they do not necessarily have to be pictures or images. For example, there's an idea of coldness that we all have. There's an idea of sweetness. There's an idea of God, right? None of these really are images. None of these are really mental images in the sense of being a picture or a representation of that sort, right? So we want to get away from the idea that these representational ideas are necessarily imagistic or visual, okay? Now, by contrast to the thinking thing, or in contrast I should say, remember you are a finite thinking thing, a finite thinking substance. Descartes says God is an infinite substance. And getting even more technical here, we'll have, again, a very famous part of this book, but a very difficult part. This is the distinction between what Descartes calls objective and formal reality. Two different types of reality. I'll try my best to explain this really clearly, but this is something that students often struggle with and often trip over a little bit. So if you need help understanding what's going on here, if you need help grasping these concepts, please do not hesitate to email me. First, let's point out that for Descartes, some types of ideas exist more than others. I know that sounds a bit crazy. I know that sounds kind of ludicrous even to say that some ideas exist more than others. You might think that all ideas exist in an equal fashion to the same amount. But for Descartes, and for many rationalists, in fact, Leibniz included, and Spinoza, actually, existence is a matter of degree. right? Meaning some things exist, as I put it, more than others. For example, an idea that you have of substance has more objective reality than an idea that you may have of a mode. Repeat that. An idea that you have of a substance, like your mind or God, has more objective reality than the idea that you may have of a mode, like the color of something, or the shape of something, or its location. Now, an objective reality, and I'll elaborate much more on this in a moment, but objective reality is something that pertains only to ideas. Only ideas have objective reality. And objective reality means nothing more than the extent to which this idea represents some so-called real thing. Okay, so don't get confused here, right? Remember that ideas are modes, and you can have an idea, which is itself a mode, of a mode, like color or volume or location. But what Descartes takes to be self-evident is that the efficient or total cause of an idea must have at least as much reality as its effect. And this is going to play into the relation between objective and formal reality. Again, as I told you, objective reality meaning just the extent to which an idea is capable of representing something else, something that is supposedly real. So let's elaborate a little bit on the argument for this to understand what Descartes means when he says that this cause must have at least as much reality as the effect that is produced. Descartes takes for granted, and he's here sort of taking for granted people like Thomas Aquinas and the scholastic philosophers, that what is more perfect cannot follow from what is less perfect. You can never have a cause that is less perfect produce an effect that is more perfect than the cause. It just doesn't make sense as far as Descartes is concerned. Now, ultimately, what this means is that everything that's out there follows from something that is most perfect, right? Meaning everything that is out there is ultimately caused by some maximally perfect thing. If you're a religious person, you can probably already tell where we're going to go with this. Now, as I said, more perfect cannot follow from less perfect, and ideas are considered part of everything. So when I said above that everything follows from that which is most perfect, included in everything there, which I have underlined, are, importantly, ideas. So again, linking all of this up, tying it up, what does this mean? It means that my ideas have to have causes that are more perfect than they are. My ideas have to have causes that are more perfect than they are. Again, this is why we say that some things exist more than others. So Descartes will say that ideas that display substances to me are something more, and if I may say so, contain within themselves more objective reality than those which represent only modes or accidents. And he goes on to say that the idea of God has more objective reality than the ideas that he has of all other substances, all of which are of course finite, unlike God, which for Descartes is an infinite substance. He continues that it is evident by the light of nature that there must be at least as much reality in the efficient and total cause as there is in the effect of that same cause. So another way to put this in like vernacular English, another way to think of this is that a cause has to be powerful or potent enough to produce some effect. And we mean this in a metaphysical sense. Right? Today we know that physically and chemically something like a nuclear bomb seems to violate this logic, something that is in its first state less potent and then produces some horrendous extraordinary explosion as an effect, right? So we'll put that to the side as something that seems to be an exception. And of course, we probably should do so anyway, because as I wrote, that's a physical or a chemical situation. What we're talking about is metaphysical causality, things that do not exist in space-time, right? Things that are not physical, things that are not corporeal, things that do not have a body. And Descartes will add, something cannot come into being out of nothing, right? Including even ideas. And that which is more perfect cannot come into being from that which is less perfect. So what does this mean? Again, putting it in simpler terms that make more sense. What he's saying is that I cannot have any idea that isn't caused. Every idea is ultimately going to be caused by something. And it's true that I myself could be the cause of at least some of my ideas, so long as I have enough quote-unquote reality to produce these ideas, which we're considering to be our effects. So let's turn again to objective reality, which I've already kind of hinted to you what it is. Objective reality belongs to ideas, and only to ideas. It's what defines them. Formal reality, by contrast, belongs to the cause of an idea, that which the idea tries to represent. And only ideas have objective reality, but everything has formal reality. Even an idea has formal reality, okay? But ideas are the only things that have objective reality. Why? Because of their representational status. So I'll elaborate much more upon this, but the best way to explain objective reality in really ordinary English is to say that it's a measurement of how substantial the thing is that the idea is trying to represent or refer to. Again, it is a measurement of how substantial is the thing to which an idea refers. Okay? So we would add that objective reality is subordinate to formal reality, meaning it answers to it, meaning that formal reality is, so to speak, higher. And objective reality pertains only to ideas, as I told you, but formal reality pertains to everything. And I want to take a second to note here that this is a really weird way of using the word objective. A lot of us use the word objective to mean the opposite of bias, the opposite of subjectivity, things in the external world that do not depend on perspective, that are not relative. This is not at all the way that Descartes is using this term. He's using the term objective in a way that refers to the nature of the thing that is represented. Something else I want to point out is that the objective reality of the dog, or the idea dog, I should add, that's an important difference. The objective reality of the idea dog is not the physical dog with the head in your lap. Again, this is kind of what we might assume objective to mean, but this is not at all the way this is working in Descartes. So for Descartes, objective reality depends on the substantial or ontological status of that which is represented by the idea. So what on earth does that mean? I've told you it a few times now. Well, we have to ask ourselves, what do you have an idea of? Is the idea of a mode? Is it something like a color or a location? Is the idea of a substance something like God or yourself, your ego? So as I wrote there, what kind of substance? Since there are different types and some exist more than others depending on their finitude or infinitude. But again, remember, all ideas must have causes. And as we said, there must be some first idea that we have to ultimately arrive upon, whose cause is a sort of archetype that contains formally all the reality that is in the idea merely objectively. So we didn't read Aristotle, but this is an idea that's very similar to arguments you'll find in his writings. And again, if you're a religious person, you can probably already tell where we are heading with this first cause, this first idea that contains formally all the reality that is in everything that is produced as an effect. So here I have a little chart, and this is usually where the difference between formal reality and objective reality starts to make the most sense for my students. So let me first explain how you should read this chart before we get to the specifics. You'll notice we have 3 columns. On the left we have different things, right? Some of which are actually not things at all, but ideas of things. As we go near the bottom, you see ideas are bolded. In the middle column, we have degree of formal reality, where I will list out how much formal reality the thing has. And lastly, we have objective reality. You'll notice that the first 4 cells are blank because the first 4 cells correspond not to ideas, but to things. And I told you that objective reality is something that only pertains to ideas. So you'll see that filled out in the bottom 4 cells of that third column. So let's start out with a simple thing, a dog. And I don't mean your idea of a dog. I don't mean the way your dog looks. I don't mean the dog that appears to you in your vision. I mean rather a dog itself. The actual dog. that exists, not viewed by anyone, not experienced by anyone, but just the dog as such. This dog has a formal reality in a medium degree. Why? Because it's a finite substance. Your dog isn't infinite. Your dog cannot do anything. Your dog does not know everything there is to know. Your dog is limited, right? At the same time, though, your dog is not a mode, right? Your dog isn't on the same level as something like the shape or location of your dog. There's something more fixed, more definite about your dog, and this is your dog's substantiality. Let's imagine that your dog is like a reddish sort of brown color, not unlike the dog that you'll see near the bottom right corner of this slide. This redness that your dog has, and again, we're not talking about even the way that redness appears or the way that redness looks to you or something like this, but redness as such. This redness has a low degree of formal reality because it is nothing but a mode. It is not a substance. It is something that does not exist on its own in the way that a dog exists or in the way that a mind exists or God exists. It is rather something that is a property of other things. It is an aspect of other things. It is mapped on to other things. So it has a low degree of formal reality. Let's move next to a mythical creature, a hippogriff. You see a representation of one in the bottom left corner of this slide. But again, we do not mean here an image of a hippogriff. We do not mean an idea of a hippogriff. We mean the hippogriff as such. Notice what you have in the second column under formal reality. None, right? We have even less formal reality than we have in a mode, and obviously less formal reality than we have in the case of the dog, who is finite. Why do we have none? Well, as far as we know, the hippogriff does not exist, right? We have more evidence that redness is something real than we have evidence that the hippogriff is something that is real. Now, I should add, and I hope I don't confuse you in saying this, but there's been several centuries of scientific advancement past where Descartes was in his lifetime, and some people today doubt that there is any such thing as redness as such, right? Maybe the only redness there is redness that is perceived by animals or even perceived by robots or artificially intelligent machines, this sort of thing. We're going to assume that redness does exist in itself and does not only exist in the minds of observers or perceivers, okay? So the hippogriff, as far as we know, is not real. There is no hippogriff in the external world. There is no such thing. So the hippogriff has no formal reality. Lastly, let's look at the case of God. And again, not God as described in the Bible, not God as you experience maybe in prayer or meditation, not God as you see depicted in a painting in an old church in Italy, but rather God himself or herself, however you prefer to think of it. God has the highest possible amount of formal reality. There is nothing more real, as far as Descartes is concerned, than God. So God is an infinite substance. God is all-powerful. God is all-knowing. God is maximally perfect in every possible way. So God has the highest degree of formal reality. You'll see again, as I already told you to the right, under objective reality, none of these four things that we have discussed have any objective reality whatsoever. They don't have any objective reality because objective reality is something that only applies to an idea. Only applies to an idea because it is a way of describing the thing that is represented, a way of describing the ontological status of the thing towards which the idea points. So let's start over here in the left column, or the middle column, I should say, formal reality. And let's first notice that the formal reality of all four of these ideas isn't actually the same. And you'll notice that I have ideas of the same things that we had at the top. So we have an idea of the dog, an idea of redness, an idea of a hippogriff, and the idea of God. It doesn't matter what the idea is of, it always has a low degree of formal reality. Why? Because it is nothing but a mode. It's an idea. Remember, we said a couple slides ago that ideas are like the modes of your mind, of an intellect, right? Ideas come and go. They do not define your intellect. They do not define you as a thing, a thinking thing, a powerful intellectual mind with rationality and reason, right? These ideas are things that are just mapped onto your mind. They are things that you do not define yourself by. So it doesn't matter what the idea is of, it will always have a low degree of formal reality, even if we're talking about the idea of God. Notice that the idea of God has the same low degree of formal reality as the idea of the hippogriff or the idea of redness, okay? So it's kind of a surprising thing. You want to make sure you have that down in your notes. Let's turn to the last third column here and take a look at the differences that come down to objective reality of these ideas. We'll start, of course, with the idea of the dog. The dog has a medium degree of objective reality. Why? Because it represents a finite substance. The idea of the dog that you have represents something that is actually out there, as far as we know. Something that's finite, just like your mind, okay? Now let's go down one row to the idea of redness. We'll find that here we have a low degree of objective reality. Why? Because this idea of redness that you have doesn't represent a substance, but instead represents a mode. It represents something that comes and goes, some property of a substance, right? The redness of your car, or the redness of a fire hydrant, or an apple, or a dog, or what have you. Next, we have the hippogriff that we're pretty sure does not exist. Notice, here's something kind of weird. You might expect this to say none here, but we actually have medium objective reality. Even though there is no hippogriff, the idea represents what would be a finite substance, okay? Some people, of course, would say the same of God. They would say there is an idea of God, but there is no actual God. And we still have a account of the objective reality of the idea. We assume here what the formal reality of the thing would be if it exists. Descartes, of course, will think he can prove that God exists, for the record. But the idea of God is high, even higher than the idea of the dog or the idea of the hippogriff. Why? Because the idea represents an infinite substance. So I want to point out one last thing here. Notice how in the formal reality column, those first four cells, medium finite substance, low mode, none, and higher infinite substance, for the most part, with the exception of the hippogriff, map on perfectly to the objective reality column down at the bottom, right? Notice that the dog has a medium degree of formal reality as a finite substance, and the idea of the dog has a medium degree of objective reality for the same reason, because it represents a finite substance. So you'll notice that same pattern for the idea of redness and for the idea of God. The hippogriff is the only exception, and really we only assume there that the hippogriff exists, and then we map out how much objective reality is had. So what do we conclude here? What are we working towards? Well, I cannot be the cause of at least some of my ideas, particularly those that have a high degree of objective reality, including the idea of the infinite, but also the cogito, which just means the I think, right? We're just talking about the self or the I there. Why do we include here the I or the cogito? That seems like a weird thing, right? After all, we've said that the cogito is a finite substance. Well, it comes down to this. All finite causes are caused by other things, and to avoid an infinite regress, meaning extending on to infinity, imagine like an infinite chain of dominoes that never stops, we would need that first infinite substance that causes the cogito to exist, right? That cause cannot be myself. We just cannot work in this way, otherwise we would have to extend our chain of causes till an infinite depth. So there must be some other cause. There must be something else out there that can account for the formal reality of these substantial ideas. In particular, when I say substantial ideas, I'm referring to the idea of God, the idea of the infinite, and also the cogito. Now, why is all this necessary? What's the point, so to speak? Well, remember, the idea here is that the cause of an idea must have at least as much formal reality as contained in the objective reality of the representation itself, meaning the idea. The idea, in other words, has to be caused by something that has at least as much formal reality to produce it. If you're scratching your head here about that hippogriff and how on earth we could have that hippogriff idea if there was not some actual hippogriff out there with enough formal reality to produce that idea, well, this is tricky, but you're doing good for noticing that this would be a problem. The idea ultimately comes down to, it is us, it is humans, it is our minds that came up with these fantastic mythical creatures, whether they're hippogriffs or dragons or other talking animals, okay? Meaning, in short, that it is the imagination, that we can explain how these ideas come up, but we cannot do the same when it comes to the idea that we have of the I and the idea that we have of God as infinite. So next we want to turn to a very important distinction that Descartes will raise here in this third meditation between two different types of falsity or falsehood. This is the distinction between formal falsity and material falsity. Formal falsity is the kind of falsity that we have when we make a bad judgment, when we make an erroneous judgment. Material falsity, by contrast, is the kind of falsity that we have when we have an idea that represents a non-thing as if it was a thing. Now, we have an example. If it is true that cold is just the lack or absence of heat, then any idea that you have of cold as something positive is actually a materially false idea. Why? Because it's representing something that is a non-thing as if it was a thing, right? It is taking something that is a lack or an absence of something else and is trying to say that it is its own thing. This is what Descartes calls materially false. So we're going to need this in a few minutes when Descartes is going to ask whether it's possible that the idea of God is an idea that is materially false, meaning an idea of a non-thing that comes off as or presents itself as a something. So if I am a substance, then I can account on my own for the formal reality that is required to cause the ideas that I have of substances, or at least some substances. There's one substance for which this isn't the case, and that is God. God as infinite substance. And it's to the extent that I couldn't have came up with this on my own, God necessarily has to exist. To put this another way in ordinary English, we could say that because I am finite, because I have a limited mind, I could not possibly, as far as Descartes is concerned, be the source of the idea of the infinite. I don't have a powerful enough intellect to just come up with that idea. And the reason, again, comes down to objective versus formal reality. So Descartes will actually say a few rather surprising things here at the end. He'll say that I perceive the infinite before I ever perceive the finite. I perceive God, and we don't mean see the face of God or know God in completeness, but we mean be aware of God before I'm aware of anything finite, at least according to Descartes. So too do I perceive God before I even perceive myself. This is something that I think some people maybe would push back against. They would say that children are able to have an awareness of self before they're able to have an awareness of God. But what Descartes is saying is that we have to some extent, we have to on some level be aware of God for it to be possible to even perceive the self in the first place. So we have a question here. How do I know that I am imperfect? How do we know that I am limited, if not for some idea that we have to compare it with, right? Some idea that we have of perfection, of completion, and so on. This is why the idea of God cannot be materially false. This is why the idea of God cannot be an idea of a something that is in fact a nothing, like the idea of cold as a positive rather than a lack of heat. So how do we know this? Well, the idea has more objective reality than any other idea. Just as God as such, not the idea of God, right? Not God in the Bible, not God who is seen by a prophet, not God who is described in a song, or God who is present to you in prayer, but God in and of himself or herself has more formal reality than anything else out there. And this, of course, is assuming that God does exist. So you can already kind of see traces of one of the main problems that people for hundreds of years have pointed out with this book. It is a bit circular. Now, for the reason that we only assume that this God is out there, is real in and of himself or herself, because we have the idea, and because we have the idea clearly and distinctly. But Descartes is going to say that we should trust clear and distinct perceptions because of God. So again, that's circular reasoning, or at least appears to be so. But we'll ignore that for now and return to it later and point out what Descartes is really working towards here, and that is that the idea of God, not God himself, right, not God as such, but the idea of God is the most, or the clearest, I should say, and the most distinct of all clear and distinct perceptions. You have no clear and distinct perception that is as clear and distinct as the idea of God or the idea of the infinite. And we'll entertain here at the end a few objections that Descartes himself entertains. The first of which is, isn't it possible that I am God? First, we want to motivate this objection. When I say this, what I mean is we want to sort of explain why it is of concern. We want to kind of hype it up, so to speak. We want to defend it as something we should be worried about, okay? So here is the motivation. I'm always gaining knowledge. I'm always getting smarter. I'm always learning more. Isn't it possible that someday in the future I maxed out? I reached perfection. I knew all there was to know. I became perfect in my knowledge. If this is possible, then it could be true that I am wrong about all of this. It is possible that I could be God. Well, Descartes is going to say, this cannot be the case. This objection is not anything we need to worry about. Why? Because the idea of God, or God himself really, has no potential at all. Anything that has to build up has potential. Anything that has to build up or work towards completion is imperfect, meaning exists less, meaning is not complete. God is not like this. The infinite is not like this. It is always already infinite. There's another response. It doesn't seem possible that we could have an infinite body of knowledge, even if we had an infinite amount of time. We seem to be limited. We do not seem to be capable of having an infinite amount of knowledge in our minds. However, we would need to have a body of knowledge like that if we were to be God. So Descartes will dismiss this objection. How then did I get the idea of God if it's not possible that it is from myself, if it is something that must have been sourced from outside of me? Then we need to address this question. Descartes will first say that I did not get this idea of God from my senses, because my senses often present things unexpectedly to me. It's kind of an odd way to put it, but what he means is that you do not always expect to smell something bad. You do not always expect to see a bright flash of light. You do not always, in short, expect your senses to give you the information that they give you. The idea of God, though, is not unexpected like this. It is not something that comes out of nowhere. It is something that Descartes thinks can be accounted for much more naturally and regularly. Descartes will also say that it is not possible that the idea of God is just made up by me. Why? Well, he says, I can't add to or remove from the clear and distinct perception that I have of the idea of God. I have this clear and distinct perception of God as infinite substance, and it is what it is. It is already finished. It is already complete. I cannot add to it or remove from it or alter it in any other way. So what we'll do then is reason backward from the idea of God that we have to the real existence of God as such. And I should add here that even if you're an atheist, you may want to just substitute out God with the infinite, because that's really all Descartes has in mind here. He isn't necessarily talking about the anthropomorphic God of Christianity or Judaism. He isn't necessarily talking about the Allah that is referred to in Islam. Okay, he's talking about a philosophical God, a God who is not worried about prayer or sin or heaven and hell and these sorts of things, despite the fact that Descartes was Catholic. Okay, and this is the difference between philosophy and theology. You'll want to remember this when it comes time to write your paper in your class. There's a difference between these two disciplines. Now again, as I was saying, we're going to reason backwards from this idea of God or the idea of the infinite to the real existence of God or the real existence of the infinite. So it's true that the idea of anything that is a finite substance could just have been in theory produced by me. After all, I have a sufficient amount of formal reality to produce those ideas, but I couldn't come up myself with an infinite substance. Why? Again, because I am finite. I am limited. Well, what this means then is that the idea of God must be innate, just like the idea of the cogito, the idea that I have of myself. And at the end here, Descartes will recapitulate his argument in this chapter. He'll say the whole force of the argument rests on the fact that I recognize that it would be impossible for me to exist, being of such a nature as I am, namely, having in me the idea of God or the infinite, unless God, in fact, did exist. Right? So let me read that again for emphasis. It would be impossible for me to exist, being the way that I am, namely, in other words, having in me the idea of God or the idea of the infinite, unless God or the infinite did in fact exist. So to return to this question of, is it possible that God could be a deceiver? If God is a deceiver, then clear and distinct perception would be suspect, would be not trustworthy. Descartes will say that it's self-evident that fraud, deception, lying, misleading depend on defects. So the God that we have a clear and distinct perception of obviously cannot be a deceiver, because this clear and distinct perception of God that we have does not have any defect. This clear and distinct perception is one of perfection, one of total completion, one of infinity. With that, we will end this lecture, and I'll start next week with Meditation 4.